Hey everyone, welcome back to my round 6 recap from Biel. In this game, I played Jonathan Monteverde, rated 2074. And coming into this game, I had a little bit more time to prepare than usual because yesterday was a rest day. I did play the Blitz tournament yesterday, stay tuned for some fun footage of that. But I basically had a day and a half to research my opponent and decide which opening to go for. And I decided to play a completely new line that I've never played before, starting with knight f3, d5, and then e3. For those that have been watching my recaps closely, you'll maybe remember that I played b3 in round 2, but e3 is a very new move for me. And if we look at this position in the Masters database, e3 is the 4th most popular move. But what I did to learn this opening was I actually plugged in Hikaru's chess.com games into a site called openingtree.com, and it loaded in over 24,000 of Hikaru's games, mainly Blitz and Bullets. But I knew that Hikaru likes to play this line, so what I did was I basically just went through his opening repertoire, starting with this position. And for a few hours before the game, I just looked at the different possibilities Black can play and what Hikaru does in response. So my game plan coming into this game was basically just to follow Hikaru's opening repertoire within the system and get my opponent into a position that maybe he would be a little less comfortable with. So going back to Lichess, I should note the point of e3 is to avoid certain lines Black can usually play against already. For one, lines that involve bishop f5 and bishop g4 are a bit less attractive because white has a quick c4 and queen b3, which I was ready to play. On top of this, if we go back and look at the move c4, I check my opponent's games and he likes to play d4 in this position. So e3 is essentially a preparatory move, making it so c4 can be played, and then it's a lot more difficult for Black to actually get in the move d4. So I played e3, and my opponent took his first think of the game on just the second move, and he played knight f6. I quickly played c4. He played e6, and I played knight to c3. And for the most part, I knew that this is what Hikaru likes to do, basically delaying d4. And after bishop to e7, I play pawn to b3. Now, I will say that before the game, I was looking more at bishop d6 lines, but I've played this position a lot from the Black side, and it's actually a line that I haven't been super comfortable with over the years. So it's nice playing the other side of the line, and I already knew some ideas from the white side, just based on my experience from playing this position as Black. So going forward, after castling bishop b2, b6, I take on d5, opponent takes back. And in this position, I was debating between two different moves. We do see there's a game Hikaru against Topalov. Hikaru played d4 in this game, but I was debating between either playing pawn d4, which I was aware that Hikaru usually goes for, but there's another kind of cool trendy move that's been popping up recently, is this move pawn to g3. And it's only been played a few times in this specific position, but the idea would be to play bishop g2, castle, and then have the double fianchetto with just long-term pressure in the center. So I was very tempted to play g3, but I figured that I would stick with the more mainstream move, and I played d4. And in this position, my opponent surprised me a little bit. I was either expecting bishop to b7 or bishop f5, but he started with the move pawn to c6, which is pretty rare. And at this point, I'm officially out of any sort of opening preparation, but it's still a pretty solid position for white, and it's just a matter of completing development. So let me hide the notation to avoid spoilers. And going forward from here, I played bishop to d3, and my opponent played bishop a6, which is maybe explains the reason why he played c6, was to wait for me to play bishop d3 and then offer the trade of bishops. And now I'm in a situation where I don't really want to trade my light squared bishop because It's a great piece with this pawn structure, but if I play bishop c2, then this bishop actually is very strong, preventing white from castling. So I was mainly debating here between taking on a6 or just leaving the tension between the bishops. And I chose to leave the tension with the move knight e5. And this does threaten to take advantage of the fact that this knight is overworked, so I'm threatening to take on a6 and then take on c6 if black's not careful. But he took on d3 first, I take back with queen. And it is a little bit awkward for black in this position because the knight on b8 is tied down to defending the c6 pawn. So he played the move knight f to d7, which does look passive, but it's a move that I was expecting. I think it's the best approach for black to try and get rid of this knight from e5. So here I castle, and then he takes, and I take, and the structure transforms a little bit. I now have this extended pawn on e5, double e-pawns, but I figured that the e5 pawn isn't super weak because in most cases it's supported by the bishop. In other cases, I can play f4, queen f5 to support it further. So I was still feeling pretty good here. And then he plays knight to d7, attacking the pawn. I played knight e2, unleashing the bishop to defend the pawn. And then he plays pawn f6. And I think this is a first real critical moment for me in the game, because I have a lot of options here. I can take on f6. I was considering playing e6, which would, I think, walk into a line like knight c5 and then queen f5. But ultimately, I chose to play the move knight to f4, exploiting the fact that e6 square is now undefended, and I'm threatening to fork the queen and the rook. Now, when I played this move, I actually overlooked my opponent's response. What I was expecting was knight takes e5, and I was actually expecting him to sacrifice exchange, after which I would take, go in. I thought maybe he would play e4, and then let's say not queen c3, maybe queen e2, queen d7, takes. And I spent a lot of time exploring this position in my calculations and trying to gauge whether black is okay or if white can play for a win. I figured white should be having very good winning chances here, having the rook for bishop and pawn. But we didn't go into this because my opponent played what I think is the best approach, is to take on e5 with a pawn. And after I played knight e6, I completely forgot that my opponent has a move knight c5, and I'm not actually winning the exchange, given that my queen is attacked and the knight's attacked. And here, if I want to take on d8, then we trade queens. But I think this line is good for black, because if I take on c6, there's bishop d6, and I'm not winning e5, and my knight is a bit misplaced, my bishop's attacked. So rather than going for this, going back a few moves, after knight c5, I just trade knights, and after he takes, I take on e5. So a lot of liquidation, a lot of trades, and it's still equal material. But I was still feeling comfortable just because I have these two half-open files, the C and D files, and it just seems like a very easy position for white to play, bring the rooks in, and pressure the pawns, which could very easily be targets. And here I was expecting my opponent to play bishop d6 to offer the trade of bishops, but he played the move bishop to e7, which does look a little bit passive at first. And the first thing that came to mind was the fact that I have queen c3 hitting g7 and c6. But I ended up just quickly rejecting this move because I thought bishop f6 is a useful way for black to defend, because my queen would be tied down, and if if I take on f6, black can take back and defend c6. But after the game, I had a quick call with Jonathan Monteverde, who was doing commentary for my Twitch channel, and he told me that I had a missed opportunity here. A queen c3 is actually very strong for white, and what I missed is after bishop f6, this is white to move, and white has actually a pretty simple continuation. I can just take on c6, allow bishop takes e5, and then win the bishop back and just be up a pawn. So this was a pretty unfortunate missed opportunity, because I think if I found queen c3, black would have been under major pressure. Now there are some kind of confusing lines here. The best move for black is to play c5, and I can't actually take on g7 because there's this move d4, which would win the bishop. But after a move like rook to d1, white is in full control, and the d-pawn is actually a very big target now. Ideas of rook d3 and rook fd1, I think it's very likely that white will be winning a pawn. There is even triple battery potential to just triple stack on the d-file. So unfortunately, we didn't go into that, and instead of queen c3, I started with rook c1. And it still seems like white's applying a lot of pressure, but my opponent played very solidly to just cover all the bases, starting with bishop f6, and I avoid the trade of bishops. He defends the c-pawn. I bring my rook to d1, and then he plays bishop to h4. And I have to be careful here that I don't allow the position to simplify too much. And I really wanted to keep bishops on the board, but if I avoid the bishop trade, then there could be some issues with f2. So I decided here to play the move rook c2, basically just preparing either rook to c1 to double on the c-file, or maybe even rook d2 and eventually e4. So I'm keeping the options open which file to double up on. And here my opponent took on g3, I take back, and he plays queen to f6. So putting some pressure on f2, my c-rook is currently tied down to defending. I play queen to a6, hitting the pawn on a7. And here I thought that it's very easy for black to blunder, because not only am I attacking the a-pawn, I'm also attacking the d5 pawn, given that now the c-pawn is pinned to the rook on c8, queen is an additional attacker. So if black is not careful and plays a move like queen e7, then I can happily take on d5 and go up a pawn. But my opponent was careful here. He played the move queen f7, which just keeps everything defended. I played queen to d3, so I didn't really make any progress with queen a6, and I decided my queen is better off in the center. And then he plays rook to d8, taking advantage of the fact that I can't take on c6 because my rook is still tied down to defending f2. And here it seemed pretty clear that he's preparing to play pawn c5 and perhaps eventually expand in the center with pawn d4, where the rook would be supporting the d-pawn. So I wanted to still keep the pressure, and here I decided to play pawn e4, taking advantage of the fact that the d-pawn is pinned, and black can't take because then I just take, and I'm winning back the queen, and I'll be up a rook in the end. So after e4, my opponent played queen f6, which just keeps all the tension, defending c6. I play rook d2, so tripling up on the d-file. And again, there's some calculations. My opponent can't take on e4 because I take. And even though I'm not forcing queen f8, I'm still winning the queen. After king f7, rook d7, the king is forced to one of these squares, and then rook d6 is coming next. So yeah, there's still a lot of pressure on the d-file. And rather than trying to relieve any tension, my opponent basically just played a waiting move, pawn h6, and put the ball back in my court. And it wasn't entirely clear how I can best make progress here, so I did take a pretty long think and ultimately decided on the move queen to d4, essentially offering the queen trade, because if takes and takes, then I think white is winning a pawn, given that d5 just doesn't have enough defenders. So I'm really trying to keep the pressure, also exploit my opponent's time situation. But he kept resisting. He played the move queen to g5. And again, I took another long think, and I decided to take on d5. And I spent a long time calculating the lines after rook takes d5 and queen c4, pinning and just putting pressure on the queen side. And I thought black is actually doing okay here after a move like rook d8. I was trying to make sense of this in my calculations. For example, takes and takes. And I don't actually have time to take on c6 because my rook's attacked. If I take here, I was trying to calculate like this king pawn ending, but I don't think white has any chances to win this. But we didn't go into any of this because rather than taking with the rook, my opponent took with the c-pawn. And I think this was a misjudgment. Maybe he was scared of lines with queen c4. But after he takes with the pawn, now I have a very clear weakness to try and exploit. And my game plan from here was to just put as much pressure on my opponent as possible and to try gradually improving my queen and my rooks as well. And the move I started with here is queen to a4, eyeing the undefended a7 pawn. My opponent defended with rook f7. And then I play queen c6, so having now 3 attackers against the d pawn. But after rook to d7, my opponent has 3 defenders, and I'm not winning the pawn. And if I'm not careful here, then maybe black is ready to push, and I did not want to allow d4, so for that reason I play rook d4. And we get a position where black is a bit stuck, basically just has to wait. So we see rook d6, I draw back with the queen, king h8, and queen to d3. So I'm rerouting the queen to a more central square, and after he played the move rook to d7, I finally had a clear plan in the position. Last few moves were just kind of moving around, poking and prodding, but in this position I play the move rook to e1. I understood the fact that my rook doesn't really have a purpose on d1 when the d5 pawn is defended, and the e-file is fully open. But the plan in this position is actually to make use of this e5 square. And what I wanted to do with this move is play f4 and rook e5. And I thought if I could establish such a setup with the pawn, defending the rook, constantly attacking the d5 pawn, and also chasing the queen away from g5, I thought this would be a really nice way to just try and dominate the position. On top of that, I wanted to have a square for the rook that controls the h5 square, so my king could come to h2 and not have to worry about getting checked, given that all these squares would be in my control. So going forward from here, we're going to see how this plays out. After rook c8, I do play f4, he plays queen h5, and I play rook e5. And this feels like significant progress because I'm hitting the queen on h5, also hitting the pawn. And I wasn't so worried here about rook c1 because I was just going to play king f2. And if queen h1, it looks like I might be in trouble, but I'm just mating in 1. So black had to be very, very careful here. He played the move queen f7. And then I take on d5. So this was a big accomplishment to win black's biggest weakness. And after takes, it still takes a lot of work to win such a position. Even though I'm up a pawn, I don't have any passed pawns, and my 3-on-2 majority on the king side, of course it's nice, but if I want to make progress by pushing my pawns, I could potentially weaken my king. So here there is a little bit of moving around after rook e8, king h2, rook e1, queen d2, rook e7. And here I figured that everything is under control, and I might as well make some improvements on the queen side, and I play b4, gaining a little bit of space. I figured the idea is to play a4 and either eventually b5 or maybe even a5 and a6 and just try and optimize my queenside pawns as much as possible. So he kept waiting, he plays rook e8, I play a4, and then he plays a move rook e2. So perhaps trying to force some simplification. And I didn't want to trade rooks because I thought such an endgame would be even more difficult to win for white. So I avoid the trade. I centralize my queen, queen d4. He plays queen g6, and then I play rook d8. And after king h7, I realized in this position that white is very, very close to winning. And when I played my next move, I thought that I'm on the verge of winning, but I didn't see the clear win just yet. But I started with the move queen to d5, which not only threatens checkmate in 1, but it also prevents any sort of counterplay with queen h5. So I'm finding very nice harmony with the queen and the rook. And at this point I was expecting the move rook e8, but my opponent surprised me with the move rook e6, which at first it looks like it walks into a fork. I should note f5 doesn't quite work because there's queen h5 check. And then after this actually, white's getting mated here. Rook e1, and this is mate. So f5 would be a terrible, terrible blunder. But rather than playing f5, I played the move rook f8. And after I played this move, I thought that black is really close to being in Zugzwang, because the rook is basically pinned to the g8 square, and the queen is very short on squares as well, and it's tied down to the rook. So there's really not too many moves black can consider in this position. And a move like h5 then allows pawn f5 because there's no more queen h5 check. So this would be winning for white. So after rook f8, as my opponent was thinking, I was expecting him to play the move queen g4. And he did. And this is a one move I couldn't quite see a clear win. And I ended up taking a lot of time in this position to calculate. And what ended up happening in the game was exactly according to my calculations. Because in this position, there is actually a relatively forcing line. And I guess for anyone watching that wants to treat this position as an exercise, feel free to pause the video and try and find not only the next move for white, but the sequence for white that will hopefully lead to a win. And I started with queen to d3, attacking the king. Opponent blocks with rook g6. And then I have the move pawn to f5. And I think at this point, black is in big, big trouble because the rook is attacked. And if the rook moves anywhere else other than f6, for example, rook g5, f6 check, g6, and this is force mate for white after rook f7, king h8 is queen d8 mate, and king g7, I have check and mate. So we got to the position after f5. My opponent plays rook f6, and after takes, from a distance, it may seem like this ending can still be very difficult for white to win, but when I looked further, I noticed that there's a very nice series of checks that allows white to win the game quite easily. And rather than showing the moves, I just want to show the arrows of my calculation, because there's a funny line that involves a lot of zigzagging. But the calculation was check, here, check. Basically, the king is stuck within these squares because of my very strong f5 pawn. Basically, I would keep checking, pick up the a pawn with check, and then zigzag my way back, and eventually get to a situation where I can have queen g6, forcing a queen trade, and then have the 2-on-1 on the queen side, and then easily win. And basically, everything played out according to plan. After queen d7, he played king g8, and at first I was gonna play queen c8 and start zigzagging, but I realized it's more efficient to play queen d5, and after king g7, check, and now the zigzagging begins, queen a8, and I take the pawn with check, and then here we're gonna see the zigzag to force a queen trade. I zig, and then I zag, and then zig, zag, zig, and my opponent actually resigned before I could do the final zag. But it was a very nice kind of study-like finish, given that it required a lot of queen moves, a lot of queen checks to finish things off. But I think it was a very instructive positional game, very, very strategic, and goes to show that even one weakness in the middle game, this isolated queen's pawn for black on d5, it can sometimes be enough to end up losing the game from the black side. And when you're white, it can sometimes be enough to play for a win. And I think I was fortunate to convert. I think maybe my opponent didn't put up the best resistance later on in the endgame, but a win is a win. I do want to thank Hikaru for inspiring my opening choice in this game with knight f3 and e3. Always nice to add a new weapon to my repertoire. And yeah, I'm pretty tired now. I haven't had dinner yet, so I think I'm going to end it here. Thanks everyone for watching. I do appreciate those who make it until the very end of the video. So do stay tuned for more chess. I'm currently 3.5 out of 6. Back on a +1 score. Round 7 is starting in 18 hours from now. So look forward to seeing you in the next recap. And adios.